All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to journey back to the very beginnings of Christianity.
That's right. We're diving into the world of the early church.
We've got some super fascinating teaching materials focused on the book of Acts, specifically chapters 2 through 5.
Yeah, and we're going to uncover how those very first believers lived and what they believed.
But it's not just going to be a history lesson, right?
Definitely not.
We're also going to tackle a question that's still being debated even today. Just
Yeah.
how exclusive is Christianity?
It's a big one. And you know what's so captivating about this particular period?
What's that?
These early practices weren't just about, rituals, They were really about survival.
Okay, I see that, yeah.
The book of Acts really emphasizes these 4 key elements: teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, and prayer. And you might think, okay, sounds like a pretty typical religious gathering. But hold on.
Okay.
The word koinonia, meaning fellowship, appears 19 times in the New Testament.
19 times. Wow, that's not just a casual mention at all.
No, definitely not.
It really does seem like this concept of body life,
Yeah.
just deep interdependence, was central to their experience.
Exactly. And it makes a lot of sense when you actually consider the context, right?
Yeah, okay.
This was a marginalized group facing very real potential persecution. So sharing everything, not just meals, but possessions too,
Wow.
created this kind of safety net, and this powerful sense of unity. Think of it like a startup.
Oh,
Everyone's pooling their resources together to make sure that the thing succeeds.
I can see that. They relied on each other not just for spiritual support, but really for practical survival too.
That's right.
It really does raise a fascinating question for you listening. Would you find that level of communal living appealing or challenging?
This is a great question. Now, if we shift gears a bit and we look at the stories about the early church, we encounter something else that's quite striking. All those signs and wonders that were happening, the healings, the prophecies, the whole works.
Yeah, it's like we're stepping into this world where the supernatural is almost commonplace.
Yeah.
But how do we understand those accounts today?
Right.
I mean, do these things still happen?
Well, there are actually a few different viewpoints on that. You've got the cessationists who believe that those miraculous gifts actually stopped with the apostles.
So it's like saying magic hour is over, folks.
Exactly. And then you've got the non-normativists who believe that God can still work miracles, but they're not the everyday norm.
Okay, so miracles might happen, but don't expect to see them on your morning commute.
Exactly. And then finally, you've got the continuationists who believe those gifts are just as active today as they were back then.
So that's like saying the magic never faded.
Right.
So 3 very different ways of looking at it. It's important to remember that we're just exploring these perspectives, not endorsing any one particular view.
Absolutely. But shifting gears a bit, it's also important to note that those signs and wonders weren't the only thing driving the early church's growth. Their evangelism efforts were also really key.
Right.
If you actually look at the sermons in Acts chapters 2 through 5, you see some really interesting recurring themes. Jesus' death, resurrection, and exaltation.
It's like their core message.
Yeah.
The real foundation of their belief. But here's something I found really interesting. They also often referenced the Jewish patriarchs in those sermons.
Yeah.
It's like they were intentionally connecting their message back to their Jewish heritage, even as the faith was, expanding beyond those initial roots.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Acknowledging their past, but looking toward the future. And let's not forget, it wasn't just the miracles or the sermons that drew people in. The early Christians were really known for their generosity, their unity, their joy, their sincere worship. People were actually drawn to the authenticity of their community.
Yeah, it wasn't all talk. It was about walking the walk. They were really embodying what they believed. Which brings us to this big question, one that our source material dives right into. Is Christianity the only path to God?
In other words, is it pluralistic, inclusivistic, or exclusivistic? These are some big words, so let's break them down a little bit. Pluralism basically says that all religions hold some piece of spiritual truth. Inclusivism says that all religions have some truth, but one holds the complete truth.
And exclusivism says there's only one true path to God.
That's exactly right. And our source material seems to really lean heavily toward exclusivism, pointing to Jesus' own words in John 14:6, where he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me."
That's a pretty definitive statement, and one that can be pretty challenging, especially in today's world where inclusivity and tolerance are so highly valued.
It definitely raises a lot of questions and sparks a lot of debate. But before we dive into those deeper waters, let's pause here and reflect on what we've uncovered so far. You listening, what's resonating with you most?
It's interesting to think about that concept of Christian exclusivism. As challenging as it might be to modern ears, it actually played out in the lives of those early believers. It wasn't just some abstract theological idea for them.
No, not at all. It's fascinating because while that exclusivist perspective might seem to clash with today's emphasis on tolerance, it actually fueled their evangelistic efforts. They genuinely believed that they held the key to eternal life, and that really motivated them to spread their message all over.
So instead of being this barrier to engaging with others, this belief actually spurred them on to connect with people from every walk of life. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. And, it really highlights the complexity of interpreting these historical perspectives through a modern lens. You can't just impose our current values onto the past, right?
Right.
We have to try to understand their motivations, the cultural context of the time.
Yeah, totally. So stepping back into their shoes for a minute, how did they reconcile that exclusivist viewpoint with this idea of loving your neighbor? Did they see it as this either proposition?
It's a really insightful question. It really gets at the heart of how the early church navigated its relationship with the wider world. Their love for others wasn't contingent upon agreement about religious beliefs. They showed compassion and generosity to everyone, regardless of their spiritual background.
So they lived out their faith in these tangible ways, demonstrating love through action rather than just words. It's like they saw sharing their belief as an act of love in itself, even if it wasn't always received that way.
Precisely. Think about the early church's radical generosity. Sharing possessions, caring for the sick, welcoming the marginalized. These weren't just random acts of kindness. These actions were expressions of their deeply held beliefs.
Yeah, it seems like they understood that actions often speak so much louder than words,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as, religious belief. It makes you wonder, what if we took a similar approach today?
That's a powerful thought. Imagine if we, as modern-day Christians, we were known more for our love, our compassion, and our commitment to justice than for our theological arguments.
Yeah, that would be a legacy worth leaving. But let's not forget, the early church faced some serious opposition. They were a minority group in a powerful empire, often persecuted for their beliefs. How did they manage to not only survive, but thrive in that kind of environment?
Well, that's one of the most fascinating aspects of their story, isn't it? You'd think that persecution would just crush them, but it seems to have had the opposite effect, like it strengthened their resolve and fueled their growth.
Yeah, it's like they say, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Each act of persecution seemed to create this ripple effect, pushing the Christian message further and further outward.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about martyrdom either. It was their unwavering commitment to their faith, even when facing real danger. It made a powerful impression on those who were watching from the outside.
Yeah, it seems like their willingness to suffer for what they believed in gave their message this certain authenticity. It's one thing to talk about faith, but it's a whole other thing to live it out when the stakes are so high.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the power of their message itself. In a world that was filled with so much uncertainty and injustice, the promise of hope, forgiveness, and eternal life, it resonated deeply with people.
Yeah, it was this message that met this deep human need, regardless of anyone's cultural background. It offered something that the Roman gods and all the philosophies of the day just couldn't provide.
You've hit on a key point there. It wasn't just about believing in some different deity. Christianity offered a radically different way of life, a new way of seeing the world and how you relate to other people.
And that brings us to another intriguing question. How much of the early church's success can be attributed to the cultural and political climate of the Roman Empire? Were they just in the right place at the right time?
That's the question historians have debated for centuries. Some argue that the social and political upheaval of the time created this fertile ground for Christianity to really spread. The Roman Empire, while so powerful, it was facing internal divisions, economic instability, and a sense of moral decline.
So people were looking for something to believe in, something to give them hope in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and uncertain. And Christianity, with its message of love and forgiveness and a life beyond this earthly existence, kind of stepped into that void.
That's a compelling argument. But of course, it's never that simple. We can't just discount the role of individual choices, the power of personal testimony, and the dedication of those early evangelists who risked their lives to share their faith.
It's this complex tapestry of historical, cultural, and personal factors that all contributed to the rise of Christianity. And yet, despite all those external forces at play, there's something incredibly compelling about the unwavering faith and courage of those early believers.
It makes you wonder what we can learn from their example, right? Like, what challenges are we facing in our own time that require that same level of conviction and commitment?
That's a question worth pondering. But before we get too lost in, introspection, let's bring it back to the big picture.
Yeah.
We've explored the early church's, challenging beliefs, their remarkable acts of love and service, and their ability to thrive even when they faced persecution. What does this all mean for us today?
Yeah, it's easy to, romanticize the early church, to look back and see them as these super saints who had it all figured out.
Right.
But they were human just like us, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they faced internal conflicts and made mistakes and probably had their share of disagreements, right?
Absolutely. They were figuring things out as they went, navigating uncharted territory. There's actually
Yeah.
this great example in Acts chapter 5 where Ananias and Sapphira try to deceive the apostles about a financial contribution.
Well, yeah, that's right. That couple who tried to pull a fast one on the community.
Exactly.
What happened to them again? It's been a while since I read Acts. Well, let's just say they faced some pretty severe consequences for their dishonesty. Really highlights that even within this community that really emphasized unity and generosity, there were still these very human flaws and moral failings.
It's a good reminder that we shouldn't put those early Christians up on a pedestal.
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't perfect,
Yeah.
but they were striving to live out their faith in this, very real and often messy way.
And that's what makes their story so relatable.
Right.
They were pioneers figuring things out as they went along, grappling with challenges, celebrating victories, and sometimes stumbling along the way.
It's inspiring, though, isn't it, to see how their faith sustained them through those trials and how they left such a lasting impact on the world.
It really is, and it begs the question, what can we learn from their example? How can their experiences inform our own faith journey today, even though we live in such a different world?
For one thing, I think it challenges us to move beyond simply talking about our faith,
Yeah.
and to actually live it out in tangible ways, just like they did.
I couldn't agree more. Their commitment to serving others, their radical generosity, their unwavering belief in the power of their message. These are all qualities we can aspire to regardless of our specific circumstances.
It's not about trying to recreate their exact practices, but it's about capturing that same spirit, that dedication, and that purpose.
Right.
We might not be, sharing our possessions or facing persecution like they did,
Right.
but there are still so many opportunities to really put our faith into action.
Absolutely. Whether it's advocating for justice, caring for the marginalized, or simply being this beacon of hope in our own communities.
Yeah.
There are so many ways to embody our beliefs in the 21st century.
It all comes back to that idea of koinonia that we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
that sense of interconnectedness and responsibility
Oh.
for one another.
You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's really the enduring legacy of the early church, this commitment to living out their faith in community, supporting each other, and working together to make a real difference in the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of the early church, I want to leave you with this final thought to kind of chew on.
Okay.
What will your legacy be? How will you put your faith into action and make a positive impact on the world around you?
Keep those mental gears turning, and remember, the journey of faith is ongoing. It's about learning and growing and striving to live out our beliefs in a way that honors God and serves others.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time, ready to explore another fascinating topic and uncover those hidden gems of knowledge together.